Okay, I think we'll make a start, if that's all right. There may be some other people coming, and they will filter in due time. But anyway, welcome, everybody. I'm Ian Boyd, and I think I've been asked to chair this meeting because I am chairman of the Environmental Sustainability Board of the university. And the university itself is looking at all sorts of different types of solutions to the problem of getting the university to net zero, let alone the nation or the world to net zero. And as part of that, we want to try to look at all the possibilities from an internal perspective. But you're all very well aware that we're on the run-up to COP26, and this meeting is all part of trying to get us as a university community to start thinking a little bit more about what needs to be done, both within the university and externally, but also what the world needs to do through the auspices of COP26. So the subject this evening is nature-based solutions, and it's a very popular kind of subject because I think a lot of people see it as an easy way out of some of the dilemmas that we have. It'll be very interesting to see what our speakers have to say about it this evening. There is certainly a need for us to think very imaginatively about the sorts of solutions that we have ahead of us. And some of the attractions of nature-based solutions are going to be around the fact that they do a number of things simultaneously. They deliver perhaps carbon savings, but they also deliver enhancements to biodiversity, places for people to go and exercise to improve health and those sorts of things. So there's a lot of parallel benefits from nature-based solutions. But one of the big questions, I guess, that, and hopefully we can try to address this evening, is how do we optimize all the various different things that we can do in particular circumstances in order to be able to get the very best out of the land and the sea that we have available to us. So this evening is structured in two halves. The first half is we have three eminent speakers who are going to give their views on nature-based solutions. And then the second half, we're going to have a panel discussion, but actually, fundamentally, I'd love it to be a group discussion about what this actually means overall. So if that's all right with everybody, unless anyone's got any other ideas, we'll probably kick off. And so we have, as I said, we've got three eminent speakers. We've got Bill Austin, and we've got Clive Mitchell and Anne McGurran. And I'm really grateful to them for offering to speak this evening. And we're going to kick off with Bill. And Bill is Bill will be known to some of you. He's from our School of Geography and Sustainable Development, and Bill's going to talk about the title is "Can Nature Help Us Tackle the Climate Emergency?" So, Bill, over to you. Thank you. Thanks, Bill.
Okay. Yeah, and then I'll press go when we're... Is it this one?
Just swap it to watch your presentation, it's just here. If you want to press Alt and Tab.
Oh my goodness, okay.
Okay. I'll be at the site just in case
Yeah,
you need me.
okay. All right, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to contribute to this discussion this evening. It's a great privilege to be able to do this. I wanted to thank everyone for coming, but particularly I think I spotted a colleague from Scottish Government, and I just wanted to introduce that I do have a role with Scottish Government supporting with advice on blue carbon. And it's been such an exciting time in my career in the last few years to realise that research, 30 years plus and counting, suddenly has some relevance to policy, and to move into that arena is incredibly rewarding. And I think it's really enriched my teaching and, of course, some of the research that I can do at the moment. So I'm going to play a short video. This comes from an exhibit. Unfortunately, it had to be online with the Royal Society of London's Summer Science exhibition. It happens every year, and we were so excited as a team to go down to London and have fun there for about a week, but it was cancelled and it had to go online. But I'm going to show you a short video because it can illustrate the type of habitat that we work on here at St Andrews. Work on a range of marine habitats, but this is the one I think we need to focus on just at the moment. And then I'll show you an infographic where the research has sort of filtered into our teaching and the voice of a student explaining this infographic concept to you. And then I've got a few slides to finish with. Welcome to my laboratory. It's a lovely day here on the coast. I'm sitting on a salt marsh on the Eden Estuary, just outside St Andrews on the east coast of Scotland. Today this is a protected site, recognised for a wide range of habitats and wildlife, where nature itself highlights an emergent opportunity to tackle climate change through carbon sequestration. Hello, I'm Professor Bill Austin from the University of St Andrews. I'm interested in climate change and I study mud. To be a little more precise, I study the potential of sediments, such as these on this salt marsh, to store carbon. We call this blue carbon, and this represents a nature-based solution opportunity to help tackle climate change by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, where this contributes to global warming. As an academic, I teach students, and this is a wonderful laboratory on our doorstep. These salt marsh habitats are very widely distributed around the United Kingdom. Perhaps there's one not too far from you. I also work with government to help deliver the research that underpins the evidence needed to inform policies for blue carbon. This is an exciting time because blue carbon is seen as one way in which you can work with nature to deliver on net zero targets. So how do we connect nature, particularly its protection and restoration, to climate mitigation? The answer lies in these plants and waterlogged soils. Not an easy sell, you might be thinking, but put simply, we need to save the mud. Why the plants? Well, in these nutrient-rich habitats, salt marsh plants can be highly productive, and as they photosynthesize, they fix carbon, locking it in the ground. They also trap sediment and organic matter that are also rich in carbon. These sources of carbon are transferred to the underlying soil, which also become rich in carbon over time. Coastal wetlands are highly effective at building up these below ground stores of carbon, which we call the soil carbon stock, and because of the generally high salinity, they tend to emit far less greenhouse gases, such as methane, back to the atmosphere. In fact, blue carbon habitats like these are some of the most effective, area for area, places for carbon sequestration on our planet. Did you know that 2021 could be a super year for both climate and nature? In November, the United Kingdom will host an international climate conference in Glasgow called COP26. I would argue that now is the time for all of us to raise ambitions for nature and to make the case for nature to become part of the solution to climate change. Blue carbon needs to be a part of these nature-based solutions. Why not click on the link to find out more, or take our tea bag challenge. Now you may be wondering what the tea bag challenge is, and now I've forgotten what the project in the States was, but basically farmers bury underpants and they look at the rate of breakdown of the cotton in those underpants. I think it was soiled pants. Soil My Undies was the project. Well, we've actually been burying tea bags in these habitats, and actually that's something we can do with our students here. Now, it was Alt. Okay. Yeah, I'll just go back to that one quickly. Yeah. And then there was an audio file.
Yes, that was back on the original one.
On there.
Yeah.
Okay, just start that and then go to the other.
Welcome to our infographic on blue carbon. First, let me explain what is meant by the term blue carbon. Blue carbon are high-density carbon stores in marine and coastal habitats, which include salt marshes. Studying these areas is important and reveals how supporting natural processes can be a strategy to mitigate the effects of climate change. In this example, we will explore the role that salt marshes play in helping us tackle climate change. This graphic shows the process of carbon sequestration through which salt marsh habitats remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in their soil. Through this process, salt marshes help limit the extent of global warming. In the first step on the graphic, step 1, we see that salt marsh plants are photosynthesizing and through this process fixing carbon out of the atmosphere. In the second step, we see that this carbon is being stored in the plants as organic matter. We call this the above ground or living biomass. The third step shows that sediments and organic matter also enter salt marshes from oceans and rivers, flowing across the salt marsh surface during periods of high tide. Salt marsh vegetation is very good at trapping this sediment and organic material, which is rich in carbon just like the living biomass. In the fourth step, we see that as organic material starts to decay, it is buried under the continuously building salt marsh sediment. Normally, during the decomposition of plant material, greenhouse gases are released back into the atmosphere. However, due to the high water content and salinity of salt marsh soils, the process of decomposition is very slow and only small amounts of greenhouse gases are released. As sediments continue to build up, the organic material in the salt marsh soil is buried deeper and deeper. This below-ground carbon store is what makes salt marshes highly effective spots for the long-term build-up and storage of carbon. Carbon can remain trapped in salt marsh sediment for hundreds to thousands of years.
Okay, so that's something where one of our undergraduates, our students here, has translated some of that research that we do into an infographic. And I think these are really powerful ways of conveying some of the messages to a wider audience. And it's been really fun and useful, actually, to develop some of these infographics with government. And government has been sponsoring some of this recently. So I need to just quickly find the PowerPoint itself. Oh, thank you. So it's that one. It's probably that one, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah, great. And it's just up and down arrows to go? Yeah. Okay.
Come that way, and then just use the left and right.
Okay, yep. So I mentioned, hi Lucy, a colleague from Scottish Government. I also chair the Government Blue Carbon Forum. And part of the work here is to try to move in the marine towards some of these nature-based solutions. Some of the work that I'll show you this afternoon is a sort of slow process towards gathering the evidence that we need to implement these habitats into our national greenhouse gas inventory. Now, of course, that process requires a very strong evidence base, and this will take some time. It's taken many decades to get to that point for our peatlands. But now, as peatlands have become implemented in our national greenhouse gas inventory, they're still net emitters, but this has driven an imperative for their restoration. And it's a wonderful success story, I think, for conservation to see the restoration, the re-wetting of our peatlands. So we hope this is where we can go with some of the work in blue carbon. I've borrowed this infographic from Pete Smith at the University of Aberdeen. It's one that I really like to capture that sense of nature-based solutions, particularly acting through biodiversity on the planet, people working with nature to create opportunities for greenhouse gas reduction, flood and erosion control, cooling of our planet, of course, food and water security, livelihoods and cultural values. And all of this, of course, works towards greater and greater sustainability. So nature-based solutions, I think, offer a great opportunity. As part of a university-wide network who have come together for COP26, a whole series of reports have been published. This is one on nature-based solutions. The community have argued that we should meet 4 high-level principles. And the first one, I think, is particularly important in the context of thinking about nature. Nature-based solutions are not an alternative to decarbonising the economy and must be accompanied by swift and deep emission cuts. I think we need to recognise this challenge. They need to encompass protection and restoration and sustainable management of a wide range of ecosystems on land and, of course, in the sea. They need to be designed with and for local communities. And they must deliver measurable benefits for biodiversity. And on that 4th point, I think one of the criticisms of COP and the work of the IPCC through the UNFCCC that organises COP is that there's been this disjoint between the climate debate and the biodiversity debate. So I think bringing these together with measurable benefits is incredibly important. So something about these blue carbon habitats. This is up at the head of Loch Fyne in Argyll, a very fine place, and a salt marsh there. That we know that about 83% of the global carbon is implicated in our oceans. It circulates through the oceans. These coastal habitats, however, only cover about 2% of that ocean area. And yet the sediments which are contained in these habitats carry about 50% of the organic carbon in marine sediments. And another way of looking at this, of course, is to compare these blue carbon habitats, mangroves, tidal marshes and seagrass meadows. We have tidal marshes and seagrass meadows here in the UK, with our forest ecosystems. And it's an extraordinary comparison to see just how productive, area for area, in these comparisons our blue carbon habitats are. So very high carbon sequestration rates. And also in that below ground store of carbon, the store of carbon that's in the soil. And we had a wonderful visit with colleagues from the Principal's Office yesterday to some of the farms in the neighbouring area, and to see efforts there to restore soil carbon. You know, it's fantastic. These things are happening on land on our doorstep. We should be, I think, celebrating some of these efforts. But to come back to the blue carbon habitats, this very rich below ground store of carbon. And again, the comparison here with tropical and boreal forests, I think probably quite surprising to many of us when we saw these comparisons. So these are comparisons hectare by hectare. So where do we go with blue carbon? We know that 2 of these coastal wetland habitats, salt marsh and seagrass, are covered in the frameworks that the IPCC gives us for incorporation into our nationally determined contributions and our greenhouse gas inventories. So this is up on Morich Moor. It's my son helping me during the lockdown when we had formed a family bubble for fieldwork. And what we've been doing is working to develop the first order understanding of carbon stocks in these habitats around the UK. And because these habitats can be managed, that management allows you, through the rule book, to implement the gains, the so-called additionality of carbon, if you can demonstrate its long-term security, against our emissions. Now, you might want to argue with me, well, doesn't nature do that anyway? And isn't it ethically wrong to use nature to offset against our emissions? I think the counter-argument I would make is that by managing these habitats, protecting, restoring, and improving the state of these habitats, we can actually get these gains from nature. And that's where the additionality comes in. We've also been part of a UKRI wide project. We lead this from St Andrews. It's called Seaside, Carbon Storage in Intertidal Environments. This is way up in northern Scotland. Ben Loyal in the background there. Collecting these sediment cores, making the carbon measurements in our laboratories here at St Andrews, trying to understand more about the nature and the vulnerability of the carbon in these coastal wetland soils. And once we have these stocks and an understanding of the stocks, our rule books allow us to implement what are called emission factors, and we can take at a very simple level some global emission factors, the so-called tier ones, and apply these to calculate the potential for greenhouse gas emissions or removals from these systems. However, the science is challenging. It's not difficult to criticize some of this science. And one of the things that we're doing, and I see Alex, thanks for coming, Alex, a brand new PhD student, is we need to understand the flows of carbon, if you like, the whole system of ins and outs into the carbon that these environments hold. And this is where some of the scientific challenges currently lie, and where I think, to be fair, there are some gaps with the rush to invest in blue carbon opportunities that we need to close some of those gaps, because we don't completely understand how these systems fully function in terms of the net carbon gains. And of course we want to understand them functioning well to gain those maximum carbon gains. Now, we hear a lot about European exits. We don't have ELM in Scotland. We have a rather different process. But I have been involved with a colleague to advise Pollination Foundation, who've been looking at the opportunities for blue carbon within the wider scope of agricultural practices across the UK. And I think there are some extraordinary opportunities to think about quite simple metrics that could be implemented at scale across these habitats, where, for example, grazing stocks, an easily gauged metric, could help us understand potential improvements that would give us carbon gains. And we could think about these at different scales, from sustainable farming incentives to local nature recovery to whole landscape scale recovery. And of course, I think working at scale is where we want to be to see the maximum benefits. Now, I've focused in these few slides on the carbon story. It's very topical in the government's agenda of net zero. What I haven't described is the role that these habitats play in the wealth of services that they provide. And one of those services is through coastal adaptation. We know that sea levels are rising. These systems can keep pace with sea level rise. They will need to be able to migrate inland. Otherwise, we get a phenomenon called coastal squeeze. But they can give us coastal protection and flood protection. So these are ecosystems and habitats which provide all sorts of services to us. And I would argue, particularly for this evening, that we don't fully account for the services that nature provides. And I think the Dasgupta review, Professor Sapatha Dasgupta's review of the economics of biodiversity, is something that's well worth looking at in the context of this debate on nature. So I wanted to finish with a cheerful slide. The future is theirs. I'm part of with Anne McGurran and Ian Boyd, we're all part of the St Andrews Prize for the Environment. And it was wonderful to hear the prize winners this week make the statement that what matters is to start at home. And I think this is right. We should look at what's on our doorstep. We should be trying to work with nature, with our local communities. And, the final thought, I think, and this I'm sure will be true of everything we hear this evening, is that we have emerging opportunities to support the government and our devolved administrations in a political commitment to nature and a new nature covenant, if you like. And if we do this, we can begin to tackle the twin issues of climate change and biodiversity loss. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Steve.
Turn this on. Yeah, there we go. Thank you very much, Bill. That's really, really helpful as an introduction. Are there any immediate sort of technical questions for Bill before we move on? Just in case anybody's got anything they want to, Edward. All right.
And it was a wonderful visit. And,
yeah.
I think this opportunity this evening has, made me reflect on the fact, that we should be developing a stronger relationship with our neighbours. And what you showed us yesterday, Edward, and I see Henry in the audience as well, is a great example for our students. And I'm very much hoping that we can engage more of the student body. Yeah, great.
Just to expand on that, we've got two representatives from East Nuke Estate here, which are the estates that owns a lot of the land around the university here. And they're working really, really hard to come up with, I would say, zero carbon type solutions, nature-based type solutions to food production. And it's very impressive, really impressive. I'm not going to let you go because I've got a question for you.
Well, that looks like an easier question over here.
Oh, there's a question here. Yeah. I just wondered. Could you use the microphone, please?
Sorry.
I should have said beforehand, we are recording this, so if anybody's got a problem, then keep quiet.
No, that's okay.
But anyway, okay, go on.
I just wondered, Bill, how much of what percentage of British salt marshes are grazed? Are they all grazed, or
it's quite a high proportion. There's a debate in the literature, I should admit, on the impact of grazing. I think there is a partial argument that grazing on salt marshes increases plant biodiversity, which would be seen as a good thing in terms of the metric that we have to look at salt marsh plant health. But of course that doesn't necessarily directly translate to their carbon storage potential. So there's a little bit of work to do there for Alex. But I should stop naming people in the audience if we're recording. There are regions, particularly down in South Wales around the Gower, where I think there's been some work done to show that the overgrazing there has caused all sorts of environmental impacts, and the trampling actually, is not good for the overall ecosystem.
I've got, Henry, please.
Thank you. At the risk of hijacking this as an agricultural point, but just very quickly, what impact does topsoil runoff have on your study?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the infographic by one of the students there did talk about the transfer of carbon, and it's one of those, I think, fundamental questions. Because if we're accounting for terrestrial carbon that's already been fixed and accounted for somewhere else, we need to understand that process. We've done some work. I can't answer the question for salt marsh because that's partly Alex's project and he's just started with us. But we've done some work on the west coast of Scotland in our sea lochs. And sea loch is a wonderful sediment trap in a way, and it has a large catchment and it captures the sediment that flows through. They're massive carbon burial hotspots, if you like. And in some of those systems, up to 50% of the carbon is derived from eroded soil. And we've just recently published some work with a colleague here at St Andrews that shows over 1,000-year timescale, so we can take a sediment core, sort of date that as you get to the late medieval period, our ancestors were more active in these catchments, and they were actually, with probably some changes in our climate system, which does, naturally flip from time to time, that's driven an enhanced soil erosion, and that's increasingly a problem. And we're doing some work looking at this terrestrial transfer into the marine environment. So it's quite a challenge, and we were talking yesterday about soil erosion and loss, and I think this connection between the land and the sea is not always well developed in our scientific understanding. We tend to do terrestrial work, we tend to do marine work, and we need to do more of this integrated land to sea work, I would argue. So.
Great. I think we probably need to move on, but we'll come back to questions later on, so you're not off the hook. Thank you very much, Bill. That was really, really excellent. So we're moving on to Clive Mitchell, who is from Nature Scot, and he is titled as the Outcome Manager for Nature Scot. So I'm not quite sure what outcome you're wanting. Well, I know what outcome you're wanting, but are you responsible for getting us there, is the question. Over to you, Clive.
Partly. No pressure then. There we go. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you this evening. It's a pleasure to be back. The last time I was here was probably a couple of years ago with Anne, and we were in the old part of the university talking about the future of conservation. So this is kind of a follow-on from that in many ways. So I'm going to talk about if you have a climate emergency, you have a nature emergency. It's a system that's co-evolved for 4 billion years. It's not going to stop doing that anytime soon. So the two things go hand in hand, and that's a really important message to reinforce. Bill's already touched on it. I'll talk a bit about emission reduction pathways and land use and how that plays into that. Framed all very much in terms of the Climate Change Committee's 6 carbon budget that came out in December, charting the UK's course to net zero, on which its nationally determined contribution, as Bill mentioned, is based, and currently with the UN. And how we move from land and sea use and from targets to integration and the kind of multiple benefits that Bill was talking about as well. And all of that, I would argue that if we're going to transition to net zero, then we need to do that in a way that leads to a nature-rich future for all of us. So in a net zero world, all of our emissions of greenhouse gases need to be I was going to say offset, but need to be balanced by sinks of carbon. So this is a little bit out of date. There's a 2019 inventory now available, but the argument's still the same. So on the left, you can see the baseline emissions in 1990, emissions in 2017 there, with the green stuff down at the bottom, broadly speaking, agriculture and land use change. So in 2030, this is the 2030 target in the current climate change plan, which has been updated, and that band will need to sort of compress down to the 2030 target, which is a 75% emission reduction target over 1990 levels. So that's still got quite a long way to go. But just to make it a bit more difficult, as Bill mentioned, in fact, in this year's inventory, wetlands and peatlands were included in the inventory for the first time. And in Scotland, they emit about 9 gigatons of carbon a year, which is about the same size as Longannet when it was running on an annual basis. So restoring degraded peatlands is a really important part of our transition to net zero. And in net zero, in 2045, all of our emissions need to be balanced by uptake of carbon in vegetation, and crucially important in soils as well. We often just think about trees as if trees don't exist in soils, and soil carbon is hugely important in all of this. So we might argue that in the past nature was kind of nice to have, but a lot of people didn't really care or didn't manage it in a way that cared enough for it. But in the future and from now on, nature's absolutely central to our transition to net zero. And for anything that we do with the land, we can't put a spade in the ground without having, as it were, something to say about mitigation, adaptation, and state of nature all at the same time. And at the same time, we need to bend this curve of biodiversity loss that we've been experiencing over the last several decades. So this is some work that was produced by Leclerc and others last year. And the black and the grey line show the existing and projected decline of biodiversity on a kind of business as usual basis. The orange line shows that what we could do with increased conservation efforts, just doing more of what we've been doing around protected areas and priority habitats and species and so on. And you can see that it flattens the curve, but it doesn't kind of bring it back to anything like where it needs to be. And it's only by adding efforts to do with more sustainable production and more sustainable consumption of goods and services that we can actually bend this curve of biodiversity loss. And that's actually been a repeated message from the Global Biodiversity Outlook reports that are done under the Convention on Biological Diversity. For the last 3 or 4 of those, they've all emphasized that current conservation efforts are not adequate. Ramping them up isn't going to be adequate. We need to address sustainable production and consumption as well. And actually, that's been a bit of a blind spot for conservation overall. We're very good at thinking about protected areas and priority habitats and species, but actually it's the other 80% of land use that matters at least as much. So, and globally, this is work done by, Natalie Seddon and group and Pete Smith and various others, published earlier this year, looking at the potential of nature and nature-based solutions to transition to net zero. So they argued that overall it could probably account for about 30% of the transition, with about 40% of that based on protecting and enhancing existing nature, another 40% on how we manage farmland, grassland, forests and so on, and another 20% on restoring degraded peatlands, woodlands and so forth. And in evidence to the Environmental Audit Committee's Bloom or Bust report back in July, Natalie Seddon was arguing that there's a significant overlap between the kinds of things that we can do for nature in a net zero world and reversing the loss of biodiversity and enhancing nature. What's not to like? And again, conservation's had a bit of a blind spot over a lot of the managed land. So I think it's important to kind of point out that when we talk about nature, in conservation terms, it has become, at least in policy and practice, the bits of life that exist within protected areas and some priority habitats and species. But when we're talking about transitioning to net zero, nature is all life everywhere. It's all part of a global carbon cycle, and we can't fiddle around with one bit of it without fiddling around with the other bit as well. So in terms of transitioning to net zero, we need to use the land both to protect natural stocks of carbon that we already have, to enhance quite a few of them as well, both on land and, as Bill was saying, in the sea. And we need to make sure that all of the other land uses, farming, forestry, and development, as far as possible, are net carbon sinks at the end of the day. Importantly, including the soils, because often we can grow vegetation in quite short-term cycles that might capture quite a lot of carbon, but ultimately degrade soils and lose carbon over longer periods of time. And of course, everything that we do with the land has to be able to adapt to the changing climate that we're inevitably moving into. So those systems need to be diverse, to be resilient to pest, disease, floods, fires, and drought that are going to come along as well. And if we don't take account of that, we're likely to kind of overstate the potential carbon savings that might be lost when a forest burns down or the trees are affected by some parasites or diseases and so on. So there's a really important question that we need to get to grips with about the scale of integration. So we have to transition to a net zero economy, we have to enhance the state of nature, we have to adapt to a changing climate, and we have to do that on the same land over the same time period. So how we integrate these demands of the land, along with all of the others that we need for timber, for construction, and food to eat and so on, is a really critical question facing us now. We've tended to kind of compartmentalize a lot of that and do, a bit of food growing over here, a bit of carbon sequestration over there, and a bit of adaptation somewhere else, but that isn't the way the world works. There's also been quite a lot of discussion in association with that about nature networks, that nature needs space to move around in a changing climate and so on. And this is a diagram again from the Environmental Audit Committee's report. And it captures quite well a lot of the current debate about nature in field margins and corridors and stepping stones for nature. I mean, that's fine for those species that can read these maps and know how to get around to the world that we've created. But actually, most species and habitats use all of the land for feeding and foraging and breeding and so on. So the spaces in between these connections are really, really important. So I'm a geologist by training, and I kind of tend to look at this in terms of the permeability and porosity of the landscape towards nature. So over on the left here, we have quite familiar territory in terms of the corridors and hedges and beetle banks and field margins and so on that agri-environment schemes and what have you support. But when we start thinking about the spaces in between the land, we'll be thinking about integrated pest management, push-pull crops, regenerative farming, better integration of forestry and farming through agroforestry, improving soil health and so on, and regenerative farming techniques. Bill mentioned the economics of biodiversity, Dasgupta's report to the Treasury earlier this year, and this report is to biodiversity as Stern was to climate change 10 or 15 years ago now. And it's a 600-page report, and it's not a light read, but there is a 100-page abridged version, which is a brilliant read, and I would recommend it to anyone who's interested in climate and nature, because in it, Partha Dasgupta really clearly spells out the relationship that we've built up with the environment through our economies and deals with some really important concepts around the relationship between population, affluence, consumption, technology, values, prices, everything that is hugely kind of topical and controversial. And basically the argument that he presents is, I boiled it down into this slide. So it's that economies must be embedded in nature, and they need to move from a kind of current linear extractive use of nature and natural resources to a much more circular and regenerative system. When you start to think about that, it has really profound implications. What would food systems look like if they were based and embedded within nature? Well, they reflect much more closely natural productivity in their trophic cascades, and we'd eat a lot more food at lower trophic levels, plants and algae from the sea, rather than, as things currently are, profit margins geared to much more overexploitation at higher trophic levels, leading to all sorts of problems in natural ecosystems. And, of course, we can extend the ideas of circular economy, which currently are concerned mainly with stuff and waste streams in the sort of manufactured economy, into thinking about carbon and nitrogen cycles and how they're operating at a very local level. So that also kind of leads to a nature first, a first best solution to societal problems, and nature-based solutions, of course, are nature-based solutions to societal problems in one way or another, from climate to population health and everything in between. So if economies are embedded in nature, then we are all stewards of nature in our individual capacities and work and all of our other roles. And if we're stewards of nature, then, well, we should know something about it, a little bit about it at least. And so we need much greater levels of climate-nature literacy than we currently have in our society. And Descriptor lays, I think, a really interesting emphasis about both the contact we have with nature, but also the sense of connectedness that we have with it in order to engender that sense of stewardship that's so vital in how we use natural resources. And much of that debate is reflected, really good to see an increased emphasis on outdoor learning in the programme for government published last month for Scotland. But it needs to extend beyond schools and the curriculum. There's a really good track record of outdoor learning in the curriculum from about 3 to 12, and it starts to fall apart a bit in second S2, S3 and so on, and then it's practically non-existent from then on. So how do we can't wait for 6-year-olds to become CEOs, so how do we get more outdoor learning in all education and training and skills development from age 3 to 103? And then finally, Descriptor's argument is that we need to practice economics in a way that reflects wider societal values, not just prices and GDP, but a much richer view of society's value and appreciation for nature and other values as well. So in terms of how we've come to look at biodiversity, this is a really fantastic piece of work that was done by the Luke Hoffman Institute, WWF, and various others. And I think spells out, some of the problem that we've got ourselves into in the way that we look at nature and conservation. And, bear with me while I read out and put some emphasis on this, because biodiversity has not, broadly speaking as a word, proven to be a compelling object for sufficient action to halt the degradation of the diversity of life on Earth. And we can see that. It's a terrible word. At the same time, the fragmentation of research and policy efforts into overlapping agendas around biodiversity, climate, oceans, land degradation, sustainable development, and so on, has prevented the conservation community from developing a holistic approach to sustaining the diversity of life on Earth. Furthermore, the predominant focus of research on describing biophysical change doesn't provide the necessary insight into the social and policy dynamics that would facilitate effective action. And that's absolutely true. The state of nature is an emergent feature of a political economy system and a socio-ecological system. We have to understand both the human dimension and the physical dimension and how they work together. So we might develop some frameworks for understanding how we develop our understanding of the world, people and nature in the 21st century. So we'd want to look at minimising biodiversity loss, but what on earth does that mean? Halting the loss of biodiversity at a global level sounds great, might make a bit of sense, but breaking that down into local and regional levels when we're talking about species at the edge of their range and constantly shifting in various ways, and focusing on particular species rather than the assemblages of species, which is something that Anne is going to talk about in a moment, is hugely important, and very much more, we need a much deeper understanding of that. We need to be much better at adaptive learning, doing things and learning from them and adapting our practices as we go along. In certain woodland systems, we haven't got time to set up experiments and wait for 200 years and see how they turn out before deciding what to do next. So we need to do a lot of that work in parallel, hedging our bets to get as much diversity into the system so that when things fail, not everything fails at the same time. We need to be much more creative in fostering cross-disciplinary approaches both to policy and practices and the relevant communities all around that. And we need climate-ready conservation. For a long time, conservation has fixed on a kind of a right state of nature, a preferred state of nature, with climate as an independent variable acting upon it. That isn't how the system works. It's coupled, it interacts with each other, and any kind of baselines we have, they're all shifting, of course, but they're all arbitrary at the end of the day. So if we rip out the rug of sort of the right state of nature from conservation, what are we left with? We can say something about there being better or worse choices in how we use the land, and we can look at those through the distribution of costs and benefits and who's involved in having a say in how that land is used and who wins and loses as a result of those choices. So that kind of environmental climate justice agenda, hugely important in terms of how we allocate and the use of and benefits from the world and natural resources going forward. And of course, resilience is key to the impacts of a changing climate and so on, and especially the extremes. When we talk about climate change and adaptation, we often focus on average change. Average change isn't really very interesting. It's the extremes that do the damage. It's the patterns of extremes that do the damage, and we need to get much better at that. We tend to focus on averages because it seems a bit more rational and a bit more objective than the sort of far-out extreme events. But those extreme events are coming thicker and faster, and as I say, they're the ones that do the change. And of course, risk and resilience are socially situated. These things look different depending on where you are and how you're looking at them. And often, we just need to be good enough at doing things, not necessarily having the right answer. So, nature, that is all life everywhere, is essential in both transitioning to net zero and maintaining it, and I mean all uses of the land and sea, and simultaneously reducing emissions, adapting to a changing climate, and enhancing a state of nature all at the same time. Anything else is making false choices, and with a fine scale of integration between land uses to generate diversity and build resilience to change that's inevitable. And all of that will lead to the nature-rich future that we need to see across all land and sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive. Thank you very much indeed. I guess one of the challenges is how do we do it at the end of the day? That's the what we need to do. How do we do it? And maybe we could come back to that later on. Are there any specific questions for Clive? Yes, please, at the back.
Thanks very much. That was very interesting and lots of points that I've seen across the board before, and some new ones. But one thing I wanted to ask you about was, so Nature Scots, what role can they play in this nature climate literacy? Because I know there are movements in England. I don't know so much about what's going on in Scotland, but surely Nature Scots could play a role in working with the government to develop that, or working with pressure groups, because you are a force with connections to government. So is there, what's being done already and what more can be done, and do you need a network of other organisations to work with on that front?
Yes, we almost certainly do need a network. An organisation of our size can't reach all the parts of the education, further education, lifelong learning, training, skills agenda that we need to. So we do work closely with Education Scotland, Skills Development Scotland, and so on, and in developing those ideas. And as I said, the statement in the programme for government to enhance the levels of outdoor learning, partly in response to COVID, resilience of schools being able to go outdoors and learn and so on, in nature that, good quality nature at neighbourhood level. So there's a connection between enhancing quality of nature in urban settings and where schools can easily get to them, as well as on school grounds. We've been running a number of grant schemes over the last few years to encourage schools to enhance green spaces in and around schools for children to use. We do quite a lot of work on training teachers to teach children rather than doing it directly ourselves. But I fully appreciate that it's an issue. Well, I think it's always been important, but the last few months have given it heightened importance, and that is something that we're thinking about how we respond to that in our currently preparing a new corporate plan, as just part of our normal kind of business cycle. But all of that is having to respond to COP26, the Biodiversity Conference in Kunming next year, and the SNP Green Agreement and the Programme for Government are really quite ambitious statements in terms of what the government wants to do over the term of the Parliament and beyond, and so we're having to sort of step up to the mark and respond to that, with outdoor learning being quite at the centre of it.
Great, thank you. Good to hear all of that.
Okay, I think we're going to have to move on, Clive, but we'll come. Don't worry, we'll come back to you in due course. Okay, so let's move on to our final speaker, and it's Anne McGurran from the School of Biology. And Anne's going to talk about making nature-based solutions work for biodiversity. So thank you, Anne.
Can you help me, please?
Which one's yours?
Oh, it's this one.
This one here. Okay.
Yeah. Is there a laser pointer?
No, not the laser pointer, no.
Okay, and this
That
is...
should work. If you try to test it out. Go the other way.
Pardon?
If you go that one, the right one, you click the right one. Yeah.
Sorry, which one?
The right, yeah, the one you're, yeah, that should stop.
Okay, yeah.
Then go left, right, okay.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here and to have a personal event. So I'm going to talk tonight about biodiversity, and as we're all very aware, the world is in a bad state, and our species has contributed to the dreadful state it's in at the moment. We're in the midst of a climate crisis, and we're also in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. And if you want a very potent image of the biodiversity crisis, the next time you're in the Bell Pettigrew Museum in the university, have a look for the species which no longer exist anywhere on the Earth. There are a number of specimens there which represent species that are completely extinct. Now, the solution that's often advanced to solve our climate crisis is planting trees. And in Scotland, that's an idea which has been grasped very enthusiastically. And as this slide tells us, Scotland is increasing its planting of trees. And as you can see here, there's quite a substantial increase. And it's also representing a lot of the new planting in the UK. But what trees are being planted, and to what extent is that contributing to this goal of using nature-based solutions to solve climate and also support biodiversity? Well, this excellent book, very classic book, tells us about the patterns of natural tree distributions in Scotland. And as you can see from the map on the right, in the Cairngorms, the predominant natural forest is pine and birch and oak. In the west of the country, it is mostly birch forest, and in the south, it's mostly oak forest. So the natural habitat, the natural woodland of Scotland, which is mostly extirpated now, of course, is a mixture of pine, birch and oak to a large extent with some other species. If we look at what's actually there today, and these are the latest data I could find from 2020, we see that the most dominant species across Scotland's landscape is Sitka spruce, and it far outnumbers the abundance, the distribution of other species. Pine and oak and birch are much less common in terms of plantings across Scotland. And there's been a lot of discussion about the extent to which these conifer plantations of exotic species, Sitka spruce comes from the west coast of North America, it's not a native species here at all. There's a lot of discussion about the extent to which that supports biodiversity. And this is a subject which is very close to my heart because it's actually how I started my career and did my PhD research on biodiversity in conifer plantations and in natural endemic woodland. And to explain that, I'm going to take you briefly to Ireland. So this is Henry VIII, and in Ireland, like in Scotland, forest is very much limited compared with the natural extent that was once there. And that decrease in natural forest accelerated during Tudor times. Henry VIII liked to fight with Europeans, and he needed ships to fight his wars. He needed trees to build his ships, and he used a lot of the tree resources in Ireland to help advance his military campaigns. So the acceleration of the loss of natural forest really increased in Tudor times. And this is an excerpt from an Irish lament written in the 16th century. It says, "What shall we do for timber? The last of the woods is down. No sound of duck or geese there, hawks cry or eagles call. No humming of the bees there that brought honey and wax for all." It's translated from the Irish. And I think this is really nice because it's a very old recognition of the fact that these natural forests are very important both for biodiversity and for the ecological services that they bring to us as human beings. Now, forest, as I said, was very much reduced in Ireland, but after the Second World War, as here, there began to be an increase in commercial forestry. And conifer plantations, particularly Sitka spruce, became much more common across the country. And when I came to do my PhD, I was quite interested in comparing the biodiversity that these conifer plantations supported relative to the biodiversity of the few relic areas of native woodland. And I did this at a place called Banagher Glen in County Derry in Northern Ireland. And there's a nice comparison here between a little relic oak wood, sessile oak mostly, with a bit of birch and other species, and a very classic Sitka spruce, even-aged stand conifer plantation. And you can see the contrast between them here very clearly. The Sitka spruce plantation has got a very boring, limited, undiverse understory. I thought it was interesting at this point. I've sort of lived this slide, County Derry, and I thought it would be interesting just to reflect for a moment on the fact that Derry in Irish, and probably Scottish Gaelic as well, means oakwood. It's from the word dara, which means oakwood. And this next slide is a map of Ireland with all the townlands in Ireland that have Derry in their name mentioned on it. So it gives you an impression of the previous extent of oakwood in Ireland. Nothing like that now. And in fact, my grandfather's family came from a little townland called Derry Ad. It was one of the very many Derry townlands or Derry place names in Ireland. Anyway, I went to these woods and I measured a whole pile of things. And I'm going to tell you about the diversity of moths. And I set these moth traps in the different types of woodland. These are, I should say, along the same river valleys. They're quite close together, quite close to one another geographically. And very different habitats. And the next two slides are just a quick summary of the results. So this is what's called a rarefaction curve, and it's a statistical representation of the rate at which you see new species relative to the number of individuals that you sample. And all of these curves have the same format. They increase very rapidly, and they start to flatten off, but they never typically flatten off completely. You just have to glance at this to see that the oakwood, the top one in red, is much more diverse than the lower one in the plantation in the sort of bluey-green colour. There are many more individuals and species in the oakwood of these moths relative to the conifer plantation. The dotted line to the right is a statistical extrapolation, and that tells us how many species we would expect to see if we increase the sampling to collect more individuals. And you can see from that that in the plantation, even if we increase the amount of individuals we collected to be equivalent to those in the oak wood, there'd still be fewer species. We can look at these data in a slightly different way. This is called a rank abundance plot. And we take the species from most abundant to least abundant, plot them in order, and they're shown on a log scale just so that everything fits nicely on the graph. Now, this, again, reinforces the point that there are more species in the oak wood than in the conifer plantation. It also tells us that the most abundant species in the oak wood are more abundant than anything in the conifer plantation. It tells us that there are more rare species in the oak wood than in the conifer plantation. And it also tells us that the species in the middle of this species abundant distribution are more even in abundance. And these are all attributes of biodiversity that we're interested in, and they're indicative of very healthy assemblages. The other interesting point I've noted here is there's almost complete overlap. All the species you find in the plantation are pretty much found in the oak wood anyway. So that always seems very clear. And it seems to point us in the direction of saying, okay, let's count species. That's a wonderful measure of biodiversity. Is that what we need to do? And I thought it'd be worth reflecting on this because I had an MSc student called Anna Kellner who was interested in quantifying attitudes towards conservation value in Scottish woodland. And as part of that, she talked to a number of stakeholders and asked them what metrics they like to use. And they almost invariably said species richness. It's a nice, simple measure. It's easy to understand. It seemed to convey lots of good things about the assemblage. But I want to challenge that assumption somewhat and say we need better metrics, or we need a better range of metrics, and we need to understand the ecology that we're trying to capture in these metrics. So the first thing is that species richness is very context dependent. This is a classic quote from Henry Walter Bates, who was contemporary of Darwin. And he went to the Amazon, and he tells us that the neighborhood of Para, which is in the Amazon, very rich in insect. He mentions, quite interesting, that the number of individuals of insects you see is not that different to what you see here, but the number of species is much, much greater than those you see in more temperate climates. So this encapsulates the latitudinal gradient in diversity. There are many more species per unit area as we tend to go towards the tropics than there are in higher latitudes. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't bother conserving Scottish habitat. I mean, the flooded forest in the Amazon on the left has many more species than this area of Western Scotland on the right. They're both valuable. They both need to be conserved. And simply comparing numbers of species is going to be a very naive and misleading way to go about trying to value them. The second thing that often comes up is this idea that diversity increases stability. And that goes back to Charles Elton, who's the chap holding the net. It's also proposed by Robert MacArthur. This goes back to the 1950s. A very conceptually interesting idea that seems to mesh with our conception of how things should be like. It's not that simple. In the 1970s, a very eminent theoretical ecologist called Robert May came along, and he modeled ecosystems. He assembled ecosystems with different numbers of species and quantified their ability to resist perturbations. And he showed that actually, contrary to this expectation, more diverse systems are actually more fragile. His argument why these diverse systems do persist was that the ones in nature consist of species that have evolved together. They have evolved their interactions together, and it's this ecological interaction over evolutionary time that's very important in maintaining the resilience of natural systems, despite the inherent fragility that comes from trying to have lots of different things to live together. And just as an aside, in this picture, Bob is holding a specimen of a thylacine, or Tasmanian tiger. And that's one of the species you can see in the Bell Prettering Museum that now exists nowhere on Earth. Bob was Australian, so that was the reason. And they come from, as I said, Tasmania. So that was the reason for that connection in this picture, which I think is in the Natural Portrait Gallery. People have explored that relationship, and there's a very nice set of experiments which were put together by David Tillman in Minnesota, where he looked at different types of assemblages which were structured in different ways. And so he assembled his plots. He quantified the ability to resist drought when there was an actual drought came along. And he found this curvy linear relationship. After just a few species, you have quite a flattening off of relationship. So there is, in natural assemblages, there is an increase in resilience with diversity, but it's not a linear relationship. And in fact, if you probe the data more carefully, you will find that this is because there's functional redundancy. You know, who's there matters. It's not just a random assemblage of species. It's not just species number that matters. Who is there matters. Talking about who matters, another classic study by Richard Southwood showed that in Britain, native species support many more species of insects than exotic ones do. And then just to finish briefly on some of our own work, more recently we've been looking at compositional change in assemblages using the Biotime database of assemblage time series. This is the first publication from that, which looked at 100 time series around the world. These are the results. The one on the left shows the change in species richness over time. You can see some go up, some go down. The black line is the overall trend. It's flat. These assemblages are not changing massively in species richness in the contemporary world. The right-hand figure is the more interesting one. That's looking at the change in the composition against the baseline. You can see that most things go down, and the black line, common line, goes down as well. And in fact, that loss or change in composition is much greater than you would expect based on the best ecological theory that we have at the time. So assemblages in the natural world, they might not be changing the number of species, but they're being reshuffled in ways that are much greater than any historical precedent or any precedent expected by ecological theory. More recent work is showing that this rearrangement of species is accelerating in the oceans much more rapidly than on land. And one of the consequences of this acceleration is the fact that the distinctiveness of local assemblages is being lost. There's a thing called biotic homogenization, and an analogy would be the shopping mall effect. If you go to a shopping mall anywhere in the world, you'll see roughly the same types of shops and outlets. Increasingly, our ecosystems are being dominated or consisting of the same species. The local distinctiveness is being eroded. Okay, so to sum that up, I want just to mention that theory shows that richness, which is great, for it does exist, but it doesn't automatically confer resilience. We need co-adapted assemblages of organisms with some functional resilience, redundancy, to have stability in these systems. Talking about native taxa, that they're obviously much better than exotic ones. You're going to have more stuff coming with them if you're going for native species. Identity matters hugely, and compositional change, I would say, is a much more pressing problem in these ecosystems around us than richness change. And fewer species are not necessarily worse. The lower species richness can actually be optimal in habitat. It matters who is there. So we need to have nuanced and ecologically meaningful metrics to quantify the state of biodiversity as well. And we need to avoid oversimplistic metrics used in isolation. So I'm going to finish off with this little bit of doggerel from, again, somebody who was writing the literature a long time ago. One principle as an ecological obsessor is that if anything is good, more of it is better. What we need to do is to capture the good without necessarily assuming or using these different types of metrics in a very naive way. So ecology matters, and I want to finish off by saying that I think here in St Andrews we're very well placed to help develop the next generation of metrics that can be used to quantify biodiversity and help protect biodiversity at the same time as ameliorating climate change. It's not either or. What we should be able to do is to address both problems simultaneously. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. That was excellent. Are there any sort of technical or clarification questions for Anne? Yes, please, at the back. Thank you.
Hi, Anne. That was fascinating. Thank you. I guess the question relates to this idea that we need to restore habitats. Are they going to be less resilient as restored habitats because they don't have this evolved species assemblages that come with them? Like, how much time do we have to work that out before we restore, or can we do these things in parallel?
Sorry, how much time do you have to work?
To understand how these species adapt, to evolve together to be more resilient.
Okay. So I think, so there are two ways of doing it. One is you can spend a long time studying a particular system and work out who is interacting with who. But I think as a first principle, if you work with things that nature has already put together, that's a good start. So if you want to create a new forest, for example, I think working with the species that are typically found together in the habitat in which you're interested, I think that's the place to start. Now, clearly, things are going to change if the climate changes, but thinking back over the history of Scotland and Ireland, there have been big climate changes in the past. So these systems have sort of gone backwards and forwards in composition and so on. So we do have that knowledge. So I think, I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think it's a problem that we can tackle.
I think we could come back to this actually, because it is about optimising for different outcomes. One is a biodiversity outcome, and another one might be a carbon sink outcome. And those two might be quite different forests, if I can put it in the forest context. Would that be right?
I think it's something we could have an argument about.
Well, I'm not going to argue with I'm not going to argue with you about it, because
I meant an intellectual debate, not a stand-up fight.
It would be useful to know if you can optimise, or you can let's say maximise for carbon sink and biodiversity simultaneously in one forest design. My suspicion is there's a trade-off there. Is there?
Yeah, well, if you take Sitka spruce, for example, Sitka spruce is generally harvested after 50 years, 40 years, whatever. And, what happens to the carbon then? It gets burnt, perhaps, or it
Well, that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
I think it's a research question that we need to address.
Yeah.
Because we are going to be harvesting this stuff, and just to stick it back in the atmosphere isn't
really
what we need to do.
If you plant an oak wood, it's going to take much longer to mature.
Yeah.
But it's potentially a longer investment in the future. So so it might be slower to start, but it might be in the longer term.
Although if you planted Sitka spruce sequentially through time and solved the problem about what you do with the wood when you harvest it, would you get more carbon sequestered as a result of that? You don't need to answer that.
You might, but the biodiversity wouldn't be great.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Any other questions? And then we're going to have a sort of panel session and a general discussion. No? Okay. All right. Can I ask Anne and Clive and Bill if you could sit here, and we'll sort of open up the discussion to everybody, because I think that what our speakers have very successfully done is opened up a number of different kind of lines of argument about what nature-based solutions look like, and what we could potentially do with nature-based solutions. But as we've just, Anne and I have just been discussing, there are different options. We need to make different decisions. And, I was wondering, I was going to start with a question, and it's really, I suppose, to you, Anne, initially, but Clive might want to say something about this, and then Bill. But there's a bit of an argument about you know, should we have native species or non-native species? And you know, particularly with respect to trees, which I think if we stick to that example, because there are some arguments about non-native species for trees, which because let's take ash, for example. Some North American ash are much more resistant to ash dieback disease that we have in this country. So, you know, why should we plant native ash when in fact actually we could bring in North American ash and use that, and it would be much more resilient to disease? How do we design a forest of the future to maximise carbon sinks and also biodiversity? So that's a question. Anne, do you want to start with that?
Well, I mean, that's a difficult question to answer, but I think if we approach it from the biodiversity angle, we want to have something that replicates the structure of natural woodlands, which means that not everything is the same age. We need some diversity in the species that are there. We need to manage it so that there are openings and clearings. That will all support biodiversity. And in terms of growth, I mean, if you go back to the sort of classic John Harper ideas in population ecology, these things are self-thinning. So if you plant them too close together, they don't do so well. So you want to space them out in a way that supports the natural growth of the species involved. So those things all matter before you start worrying too much about whether it's exotic or native species. I would say that the native species, sessile oak, rowan, birch, some of the other species, they're part of Scotland's heritage. And we should be wanting to preserve that as well as just going for trees for the sake of trees. I mean, clearly you have to plant the right tree for the right place. And not all, I mean, oak won't necessarily grow in very upland habitats, and things like birch and so on will do much better. So you need to have sensitive to that. But I would have thought that it's if you be realistic about it, you don't want to prioritise carbon sinks at the cost of biodiversity, and perhaps not biodiversity at the cost of carbon sinks. There are going to be trade-offs involved. So it's important to have a careful think, you know, about how we can maximise both sets of benefits.
Yeah.
That's what I would suggest.
Okay, Clive, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yes. Yes, it's a difficult question, isn't it? So just to add to Anne's points, we also need stocks of wood that are going to be resilient to pests and disease, as you say, and we don't know what those pests and diseases might be in the future. So we do need to hedge our bets. I'm not sure that native, non-native is necessarily the most sort of helpful way of framing the debate, because of the changes that we're likely to see in climate and the environment. We may need to be much more, as it were, accepting of changing composition of species and where they come from. We also, I think it's important to consider about the end uses of the timber, as you mentioned earlier, Ian, and that importantly within that whatever requirements that we put in place for our own woodlands doesn't lead to importing timber from other countries and, as it were, just exporting our environmental footprint associated with that. So the sort of international trade and embedding the economy and nature arguments from Dasgupta, you know, are really important in all of that. We also need to consider soil carbon and soil disturbance and soil carbon loss is associated with all of that. So it's not just the trees, but the soil component as well, and how all of that's functioning. And I suppose coming back to your earlier point, Ian, about, you know, whether you just grow lots of fast rotation Sitka and just, you know, ramp up the rate at which you're kind of planting that. As Anne said, the biodiversity implications of that are likely to be poor. And of course, if there is a pest, I mean, generally Sitka's held to be fairly resilient to pests and disease. But if something does come along, then you've lost your entire stock effectively. So I think there's an argument as well of saying, well, if you think about natives as the slow-growing kind of base load, to use a kind of an energy equivalent, and growing that over time so that you need to become, as it were, or might become less and less dependent on the fast-growing non-native plantation crops, whilst you're building up a sort of a better, richer stock of slow growth timber that's sequestering carbon and providing other benefits as well. So it's not easy.
Do you have anything to... It's
Just
not blue
briefly,
carbon, but...
should we plant more trees? Yes, we should. And the university wants to do that. How should we do it? I think we should be thinking about mosaics and working within the landscapes. And I think these can be very diverse systems. I think with the example from our flow country and inappropriate forestry, we should have learnt some lessons here in Scotland. And the restoration of those peatlands, you know, I think signals very, very strongly that these monocultures with the tax breaks that came with them to plant those forests in the first place were inappropriate. And therefore there is a need, I think, for strong policy and governance in the way that we move forward. But of course I agree with the arguments, recognizing that we need an agroforestry industry, and there is a place for that type of system. We need to be focused increasingly on biodiversity gains.
So I'm going to kind of hold your feet to the fire here a bit, because the university has got an ambition to plant forestry to address its whole sustainability problem. It's not just about carbon, but it's significantly about carbon, but it's about a lot of other things. It's about biodiversity and recreation and welfare as well. And we've got some people here who own land nearby. Now, if we, as the university or landowners, have a patch of land that we say, well, we want to put trees there, is there a decision tool available right now that will tell us or advise us what we should plant and when and you know what the harvest cycle should be and all that sort of stuff? Does that exist?
I'll go first, and then we'll go in reverse order.
All right,
but,
all right. Yeah, okay, that's fine.
I stay in Anstruther, about 10 miles away, and one of your colleagues, Toby Anstruther, made a really interesting observation recently. We've got a local group trying to collect seeds and plant woodlands in the area. And he pointed to the historical maps of Fife and the hedgerows that as agriculture industrialized were removed. And those maps are freely available. We could go and look at those maps and we could start to think about the lost habitats that in a way I think create some of those corridors that Clive was speaking of, you know, these connections. And I think that would be a wonderful place to start. We need to rethink the scale of agriculture, and I know, you know, we're moving to larger scale for the economies at times. But I think there are appropriate places where that could happen, and we could look back to these historical maps to think about perhaps some of the gains that they afforded us and that we've lost in our landscapes. I know those are human landscapes.
Yeah,
you know, I would accept that.
I completely accept what you're saying, but it hasn't answered the question, really. sorry about that. It really, Clive.
What was the question?
The question was, if I'm a landowner, right, and I've got a patch of land that I want to plant trees on, is there an advisory process that tells me what trees to plant? In other words, what do I need to buy? Where do I need to put them in the ground, and what's the harvest cycle?
Yeah, I think, you know, there are these woodland NGOs that exist that would provide that kind of advice.
Provide that advice. So, Clive, please.
So, well, in the way that you asked the question originally, I think the answer was no, not that I'm aware of. There's no shortage of advice, but then distilling it for a landowner is, good luck to you. You'll get many diverse, there'll be a lot of diversity in that advice. So I guess, but I do think we know quite a lot of, what the parameters of that decision should be in terms of biodiversity, the timber, the end use of it, the nutrient cycles on the land, how it might be used, not just in terms of the end use, in terms of felling the timber, but whether it's coppiced or other uses of the woodland during its life and so on. So I think that there are certainly a framework in which you could make those decisions. The other question, I think, and it's an important one in terms of nature-based solutions and where the stock comes from, if we're really serious about scaling up nature-based solutions in the way that looks like we need to, we do need to think very carefully about where stock comes from if it's not coming from within the UK, not least for the kind of biosecurity implications raised, both in terms of forest, tree seedlings and oysters and all sorts of things will need to be carefully managed so that we don't inadvertently introduce pests and disease as a result of that activity.
Absolutely. I don't know, Anne, do you want to even...
Well, just very quickly, if you're a farmer, your geology, your soil, your climate tells you what you can grow. It also tells you what trees will flourish.
Right. But what I'm getting from that is that there isn't a decision tool that Henry can go to and say, all right, this is telling me that my forest ought to look something like this. Obviously, there's a number of input parameters, as you've correctly said, but there seems to be a gap there that we need to fill.
Yeah, and
how do we fill it?
So I think one of the other things, actually, as Bill said, is that the advice that you get tends to be either forestry or farming, and it's that kind of agroforestry that needs to be important. And in terms of moving away from farmers, I know that the Hutton Institute have been doing some work on looking at mycorrhizal associations and the extent to which they're present in the soils that will allow woodlands to grow and expand in the ways that we'd like. Where they've been lost, working, as Anne said, with what nature's already provided and growing out from that is likely to lead to more resilient woodlands in the future, rather than just planting on areas where there aren't the mycorrhizal associations to support the wood.
Are there any questions from others, audience? Right. I've got Moya here, and then I don't know your name, but you next. Sorry.
Thank you. If I can take my mask off. Well, I have to say I agree very much with Anne that if you know your land, which is part of the thing that this strikes me as a classic, excuse me, Ian, academic discussion in the terms of if you know your land, if you've actually ploughed your fields or walked after them on them after they've been ploughed, you know your soil and you know what you've done to it. So I think this is one of these very classic discussions, that it's the understanding of the countryside, and it's the point that Clive made at the beginning. It's that feeling for it. And we've lost that in agricultural as well, because actually, if you look at tractor drivers these days, they have very comfortable cabs, and not every one of them is fit. That has changed completely. So I do think there are two elements of that. It's from a farming perspective or a landowning perspective, understanding what you are a custodian of, and from an academic perspective, it's that actually linkage to the community in which universities or academia work. So it really supports what Clive said, not that I disagree with Bill, but with Anne, if you see what's there, you know what you might have a very good chance of growing in the future. And policy has not supported that, and that is a big issue. And agroforestry, we could have a long conversation.
Do any of you want to react to that? Apart from Anne, you'll agree completely, obviously.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, well, let's talk about agroforestry later. But I'm not suggesting for a moment there should be a one-size-fits-all. Everything's going to be suitable in different situations. The other factoid I picked up recently in a discussion was that the average axle weight of a tractor in the 1970s was 1.5 tons, and now it's 11.5.
Probably weigh the occupants as well.
Yeah.
So it's okay, thank you.
But hence issues to do with soil compaction and water runoff and flood risk and all that. Yeah.
But okay, so thank you for that, Moya. I mean, I think you've raised a very important point, and that's about. Actually, I'll make it an academic point, if you excuse me. It's about data. It's about knowing your land, but actually that's about the inputs that you have to the assessment about what you would do in any particular circumstance, whether you're a landowner or whether you're at a university like this that's trying to do this in a slightly different sort of way. But the point I was trying to get at is that I'm not quite sure we're as far along the road in a practical sense as we could be. There's a lot of theory, but there's not actually a huge amount of practice. Well, there's a lot of practice, but it hasn't probably been brought together to be demonstrable to others. So that if others want to know what somebody else has done that's been successful, then it's quite difficult for them to learn that. And what we're not probably doing very well, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is assimilating all that information and using artificial intelligence and all the other tools that we have available to us to regurgitate that back out to people who really need that knowledge. Does anybody want to challenge that? Emma, please. Can you use the microphone? Yeah.
Today Google announced a whole set of tools for sustainability. Amongst them was a tree canopy tool, which has that capacity to gather data and use AI to analyse and make recommendations about what should be planted in that area. So it is starting to happen, and this is just in the States at the moment that has applicability, but people are thinking about how you can use large-scale data and intelligence to make these decisions. So it is starting to scale up.
Yeah, and you sent me the link to it earlier today, so thank you for that. So there is an underlying process here, but we need to be aware of it, we need to use it, and the more these things get used, the better they'll get, I guess. But at the end of the day, I think, Moya, you're right. It's about advising people who have land, not telling them. You know, it's about advising them about what might work best. But at the end of the day, the landowner, land manager is going to be the person who makes that decision, and a lot of that will be done on gut feel and traditional knowledge and those sorts of things.
So
yes.
I think there's a process of the other way around. Of academia sometimes.
Sorry, do you want to? Just use the microphone, sorry.
We need to know what you're saying.
Yeah, sorry. But I suppose one of the points that I was making, it's the other way around. It's not just a one-way street.
No, absolutely. It's not.
And that is important, and I think where St Andrews has a really, as a university, embedded that in a very agricultural area, where it does have links with people, it does have the opportunity of creating a living laboratory. And so I think that's an excellent thing.
Good. Any other sort of questions, points? Sorry, there was one over here and then one in the middle here. Thank you.
I just wonder sometimes if we're having a bit of a human reaction to a human problem, which is, oh, I must interfere and I must fix it. And sometimes is there some value in just not touching something for a while? And I certainly don't want to go into any kind of rewilding discussion.
That was
but,
what came to mind.
But you know, there are, because that's a very one extreme of the argument, but obviously it takes a long time for natural vegetation to regenerate, and sometimes we don't have so much time. We have to plant something to put it there, but also sometimes if you just leave things alone, then they spring up and they begin to re-emerge, and then nature is telling you what wants to grow there, and you're not trying to force it. And I think it's in Brazil. It obviously has many problems on an ecological front, but there's quite an interesting system whereby any land holding of more than 50 hectares has to set aside a percentage, I think it's 20% of that area, where the natural vegetation cannot be disturbed, so it has to be left undisturbed, and where possible, if there's a watercourse, then it must be along the watercourse so that it links up as a sort of corridor along that watercourse. And just sometimes just to resist the temptation to fiddle all the time and just to let nature make the decisions.
So let me zero in. Anne, do you want to pick that one up and then maybe go to Clive and Phil?
About letting things do their own thing. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting solution because these systems will go through a natural succession. It'll be a bit messy to start with, but nature will sort itself out sooner or later. Yeah, why not? I think it would be really nice. What I would like to do, and I'm never going to get the chance to do it, if I had a piece of land, I would just let it go through the natural succession in Fife and see what I got. So maybe somebody will give it a go.
Clive.
Yeah, well, I would agree in general, and I think that, to my mind, that follows on from Dasgupta's ideas about an economy embedded in nature. So our first intervention, as it were, should be to do nothing, and then to have to justify all the steps that we're taking that take us further and further away from that notion of working with natural processes and local situations. Yeah, that would be the complete opposite of what we do at the moment, but I think it would be a good starting point.
But Bill, I guess that's kind of what we do with salt marshes. We kind of leave them to themselves, don't we?
I would suggest that what you are offering us is a profound management intervention. It is a way of managing the land. And I think Ian's point there is that these ecosystems, will function naturally if we let them. And what we don't do in some of our management practices at the moment is let them function as they're actually designed to function. So I totally agree with you.
Okay. I'll come back to you in a minute. We've got a question down here at the front. Thanks.
Hi, thanks. It was just on the app. So as part of the Earthshot Prize, I saw the other day there's an app called Restore that you'll be able to select on Google Maps any sort of polygon, and it will tell you what the carbon potential is, what species grow there, what is natural habitat. I thought it was quite fascinating. It's not available to the public yet, but they say you can actually select your garden and it will tell you what things it thinks it should grow there. So that was quite interesting. But I have another question. We talk about 2030 and all that seems quite a long way away, but it's not. It's 9 years away, and you think, what are we going to have to do to get all the actors, the academic, third sector, private sector, government working together? And what kind of pace of change are we really talking about if we need to, drive down some of those numbers in the chart by 2030 in 9 years' time?
Good question. Can I just, before I turn it over to the panel, I think we've got to be a bit careful with Google here. Unless they actually tell us what the uncertainties are around their calculations. This is the world according to Google, not the world according to the way the world really is. And I think we have to be a bit careful about that. But and I know you probably appreciate that.
Yeah.
Can I turn the other question to the panel, or you can address the Google question if you want. But Bill, do you want to start off?
I'll go first. I think in the paper that our academic community prepared as a briefing note for Cabinet Office UK, those deep emission cuts are fundamentally what we should do. And I think most people, as challenging as that is, are beginning to understand. So I think first and foremost, that's part of what we all have to do. I think with nature, though, the World Economic Forum last year published a very convincing case for nature and the need to act sooner than later. because nature does what we've been doing to the atmosphere, but in reverse. So that was Clive's very nice illustration of net zero. So we've created these cumulative emissions, and we have a historical debt, of course. Perhaps don't go there today. But, you know, nature will start to help us. And so the sooner we act, the sooner we contribute to these goals. And I think that's a fundamentally important question, and why we need to act on nature sooner than later. But first and foremost, we have to reduce our emissions.
In passing this maybe to Clive, can I just modify it slightly and ask a question? And it was based on your presentation. Are the nature-based solutions about shifting our values as much as about actually absorbing carbon and doing the right things, which then result in these deep emissions cuts? Or is it in itself a direct intervention that is really going to make a huge difference?
Well, it's probably both, actually, I think. I think just following on from Bill's point, that diagram I showed, the global contribution of nature-based solutions to net zero, the 10 gigatons of carbon and 30% of the effort across protection, management and enhancement. That only works if we start now. And building that sort of capacity and resilience within nature needs to start now for adapting to and building resilience to the changes in climate that are coming. But I think the critical, yes, this is the decade where all of that has to happen. And of course, there are deep-seated conflicts of interest in some of the fundamentals. If we want more trees, in most cases we either need an awful lot more fencing or a lot fewer deer. And there are, in some cases, conflicts of interest around beavers and land management, but beavers do an awful lot of natural flood management for free. So in most cases, why wouldn't you want that? So I do think it comes back to your point, Ian, that there are some really critical questions here about values associated with land use that we need to discuss, and probably in a more open and diverse way than the usual suspects that sit around the normal tables having those discussions, to reflect a wider appreciation, not only from young to old, but different diversity of people who are normally involved in those discussions. So, yeah, and I think that's partly what Dasgupta is talking about as well, is then making those decisions that reflect wider societal values than just the short-term profit or GDP that might otherwise drive the decisions.
And that might end up with deeper emissions cuts, because we're making different decisions in general.
Yeah, I think there's any number of studies that show we don't need to, as it were, get into or we can still remain within the sort of Paris 1.5 to 2 degrees C range of global temperature rise, but it's going to take an awful lot of effort and very quickly. Yeah. And it is going to mean recalibrating our sense of success, the way that we project that through consuming goods and services, our sense of identity. It is a kind of an existential crisis in that sense, because climate nature is an emergent feature of our political economy, and so that very much defines how we value ourselves and our society.
How we consume.
Yeah.
As well. Yeah. Yeah. Anne, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, so what I wanted to say is a bit different. So a lot of these solutions are actually quite obvious. We know what to do. And there's a lot of kudos on coming up with a new initiative to do something. Planting a forest, for example, or conserving an area. But as time goes on, then people get complacent, and the credit or the kudos that comes from starting that initiative gets lost. So sustaining what you do is actually a huge challenge. And the other thing is that if you go to a lot of trouble to protect a nice bit of habitat, and I've seen this in the Amazon, then it becomes so much more desirable relative to the degraded habitat round about it. And that's where people want to, if it's in the Amazon, they want to fish it. If somebody wants to build a golf course or build a housing estate, this area is very attractive for that. So the longer term challenges of maintaining interest and kudos in doing a particular thing and protecting that habitat from challenges in the future, I think that's something that has to be grappled with.
So we're in this for the long term, and we need to guarantee the status of these areas that we protect.
And the system needs to have memory, and that memory needs to be valued and reinforced.
I just, comment there, Anne, that it's about then becomes about community and that opportunity to work with communities, is key, and not to treat it as an isolated bubble.
Absolutely, yeah. I think Henry had a question next, and then I've got two others to come.
I've already had my moment, so
you sure? All right. Well, let's take this one and then that one. All right.
Hi. So we're here, we're sharing all the discoveries.
You might have to just move your mask. It's just a little bit. Is that all right? Thank you.
Is that better? We're here and you're sharing all these discoveries and these theories and these thoughts. But my question is, I believe it was almost right at the start that you mentioned the carbon cycle and that there is still a gap in the knowledge. So my question is, what is that gap, and then what are we doing acting on it, not knowing exactly where it will have its impact? So where is that gap? Also taking into account that people and policymakers, if they're not absolutely certain of what it may lead to, the tendency is to avoid it. So if we don't know if there is a gap, then what are we doing?
Okay, Bill, I think that one's for you.
Yeah, I wanted to make that point because partly, as a university, that's something that we can contribute to in terms of the research that can help fill those evidence gaps. Governments, policy has a whole range of stakeholders, and there would be a whole range of attitudes in this room about forestry, for example. And equally in other parts of the Earth system, there will be these stakeholders. And so it is difficult for our policymakers sometimes. There is this, I think, tendency to overseek the evidence before we act. And I think, we have to change a little that dialogue. And we have to raise ambition a little bit sooner, otherwise, we will be in trouble. So I find that personally frustrating because science is quite intuitive, and I have a very good feeling for how these blue carbon systems work, and that there are opportunities that we're failing to grasp at the moment. And so COP26, to come back to it, is very much about those dialogues and raising the ambition and trying to move forward. But ultimately, we do need to improve the evidence, and there are opportunities in our institution to do some of that work. And I think Ian's been trying to flag some of those opportunities to us this evening as well.
Could you use the microphone? Thank you.
Sorry, I was just asking then, but what is, in the carbon cycle, what is the information that is missing at this moment?
Okay, in the specific example I gave, it is a cycle. And so there are both sinks and emissions in these natural systems. A good example is actually our peatlands, which are now part of our greenhouse gas inventory. Clive picked up on this as well. They're currently emitting more greenhouse gas than they take in as a sink. But of course that creates an opportunity through their restoration because we know they will work as net sinks. But other ecosystems are not necessarily as well understood. And one of the things that we don't particularly do very well, and I've been guilty of this myself recently, is to articulate the case for our understanding of the emissions and how management of those habitats could be implemented to reduce the loss of carbon. So soils, blue carbon habitats, hold huge stores of carbon, and they're as important to us as sources of greenhouse gases because they're not well managed. But that's one of the things that we don't understand very well in overall carbon cycle management.
Thanks, Bill. That's great. We haven't got long left, but there's a question up here. Thank you.
Is that working okay?
Yes, thank you.
For me, it's the point that Clive made is actually doing something about this because, Copenhagen, 12 years ago, we haven't really seen a lot of political will to mitigate this, crisis that we've been in for, decades. And so, for me, the logic is, if we, have spent the last 18 months being very concerned about, saving people's lives, there's very little point in doing so if you don't spend as much political will on, saving the planet that all these people can continue to live on. So, with COP26 coming up, I believe Bill's got a golden ticket to go. And perhaps he could, make that point to the people there that my view is that the politicians are run by the oil companies, simple as, and that what we should do is grow hemp everywhere while we're thinking about what else we do, because that absorbs, as I understand it, quite a lot of carbon and grows very quickly compared with trees. So that's just what I've got to think. Don't know if you'd agree with any of that.
I don't know, Clive, do you want to respond to that?
I can try in part. Just in broad terms, the most recent analysis from the UN in terms of what countries have volunteered in terms of their emission reduction pathways through their nationally determined contributions are still well short of where we need to be to get into the Paris 1.5 to 2 degrees C range. The UK and Scotland has a kind of an amber rating on that in the sense that the plans say the right things, but they're inadequately resourced. But then I think the other issue that you're flagging there, we need to kind of massively increase the rate of ambition and finance that. So we've known for a long time what we need to do and why we need to do it. But the other point that you're making about the kind of the vested interests and the various powerful stakeholders that shape politics and the economy, it's crucial that we address those as well, to stop burning as much fossil fuel as we are.
So, Bill, we don't have long left. I've got to bring it to a close. I'm going to ask each of you, if it's all right with you, if you had the podium at COP26, what's the one big message you would want to give about nature-based solutions? Clive first, and then Bill, and then Anne, maybe.
Well, I'd say that nature-based solutions are a vital part of transitioning to net zero, but they're not an excuse or a substitute for not burning fossil fuels. And we have to treat them both together, because there's plenty of things that we might do in the name of reducing carbon emissions that could do great harm to nature and probably thereby the climate in the long run as well. So things like monocultures of bioenergy for carbon capture and storage, some of the carbon reduction technologies, monoculture forestry, and so on, could be massively problematic. So we do need to tackle climate and nature together.
Great, thank you. Bill?
Well, I would thank the UK for its focus in terms of one of the 5 themes on nature. And I do have a Willy Wonka golden ticket to go on the Saturday for nature. And I'm grateful that the university went through the accreditation process to make that possible for some academics and staff here. I would say that the key issue is through nature-based solutions to engage civil society. And my fear for Glasgow, because of the circumstances of the pandemic, is that civil society won't be completely represented there. But nature provides, and the pandemic, to come back to it, has shown us this. We want to connect with nature, and it's a great way, I think, to mobilize civil society, to get the gains in emissions reductions that Clive was pointing to earlier in the discussion. If we do this, I think other good things will follow.
Excellent, thank you. Anne, what would you say?
I would say make nature-based solutions work for biodiversity as well. We haven't gone into it tonight, but obviously the reason we've got this pandemic is the sort of fallout to some extent of the biodiversity crisis, so that's absolutely essential. And the second thing is to be aware of perverse incentives. Let's make things better, not worse, and be careful which direction we point people in trying to solve a problem.
Great. Look, thank you very much. We've come to 8 o'clock, which brings us to a close. A lot of interesting discussion. Thank you for all your questions. I mean, I've learned something from this evening, which is that, well, I suppose, I think the big lesson from this evening, from my perspective, is this interaction between nature-based solutions and other interventions, and how nature-based solutions can bring people's values more into line with some of the big transitions, the really big transitions that are needed in order to get to something like net zero. And I think that's actually quite powerful. Anyway, look, I just want to thank Clive and Bill and Anne very much indeed for the presentations and also for some excellent answers. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And safe journey home, everybody. You can go if you wish.